For 1500 years you've been lied to about hell, and Baruch Spinoza knew it. But it wasn't just intuition. It wasn't a philosophical hunch. It was documented knowledge, historical evidence, irrefutable proof he uncovered in Europe's most secret archives. Imagine finding the birth certificate of your worst nightmare. Imagine discovering the exact date your greatest fear was invented. Imagine holding the original documents proving everything you were taught about eternal damnation was fabricated in a boardroom. In 1677, when Europe's most dangerous philosopher died, he left behind something the Church had tried to erase for centuries. Something so explosive that his own books were burned in public squares. Something that would forever change how you view religion. Because it turns out, hell didn't exist. At least, not until the year 553 AD. Not until a group of powerful men met in secret. Not until they decided they needed something more effective than love to control the masses. You think hell was always part of Christianity? You're wrong. You think Jesus spoke of hell as you know it today? You're wrong. You think early Christians feared eternal flames? You're wrong again. And Spinoza proved it with a mathematical precision that sent shivers through all of Europe. But before I tell you how he did it, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt something wasn't quite right about religion? That strange feeling that you were only being told part of the story. You're not crazy. That intuition you have is real, and it's about to be confirmed in the most brutal way possible. Because what Spinoza uncovered wasn't just a historical lie, it was humanity's greatest psychological deception. A mind control operation so perfect it worked for 15 centuries without anyone noticing. Until now. Imagine for a moment that everything you were taught about eternal punishment was invented. That the flames of hell were drawn on parchment by men who never knew Christ. That the fear that has controlled billions of people was manufactured in a secret room. Seems impossible? Spinoza thought the same until he found the evidence. It was 1670. Amsterdam vibrated with global trade, but also with dangerous ideas. Ideas that could cost you your life if spoken aloud. Spinoza, that Jew expelled from his community for asking too many questions, was writing something that would shake the foundations of Western civilization. His theological political treatise wasn't just philosophy, it was intellectual dynamite. And in its pages, with the coldness of a surgeon, Spinoza began to dismantle the great lie, piece by piece. But to understand how he did it, you need to know the history they've hidden from you, the story of what really happened in 553 AD, the story of how an emperor obsessed with power and a handful of corrupt bishops forever changed the destiny of humanity. Justinian I was the kind of man who didn't tolerate disobedience. He'd conquered half the known world, built the Hagia Sophia, codified the empire's laws, but he had a problem. The Christians of his time weren't afraid enough. And without fear, Justinian thought, there's no control. Early Christianity was too hopeful, too focused on love, too confident that everyone, absolutely everyone, would be saved in the end. There was a doctrine spreading through the empire like a virus of optimism. It was called apokatastasis. Never heard of it? Of course not. It was erased from the Christian vocabulary, buried so deep that even modern theologians don't mention it publicly. But in the 6th century, it was the dominant belief among the most educated Christians. Apokastasis meant universal restoration. The idea that at the end of time, even the worst sinners, even Satan himself, would be purified and reconciled with God. There would be no eternal damnation, no permanent hell, only a purification process that would eventually return all of creation to its original state of perfection. It was a beautiful idea, a powerful idea. And for Justinian, an extremely dangerous idea, because a Christian who believes in universal salvation doesn't fear the emperor as much. A Christian who believes even the empire's enemies can be redeemed isn't so willing to kill them without question. A Christian who believes in God's infinite mercy doesn't so easily accept the tyrannical authority of men. Justinian needed something more effective. He needed terror. And in 553 AD, he got it. The Second Council of Constantinople wasn't as you were taught in school. It wasn't a peaceful gathering of holy men seeking theological truth. It was a political operation, an imperial imposition, a spiritual coup d'etat executed with the precision of a military campaign. But the details of what really happened in those rooms are even more sinister than you can imagine. But here comes the most chilling part of the whole story. The documents Spinoza found didn't just describe political intimidation. They described the psychological methodology used to implement the new eternal hell. Justinian had hired the best rhetoricians of the time, experts in mass persuasion, masters of what we would today call psychological propaganda. And they had developed a specific plan to implant the fear of eternal punishment into the popular mind. The plan had 3 phases. And when you understand how it worked, you'll realize you're still living under its effects. Phase 1, redefinition of language. They took all the words early Christians used to talk about temporary purification and reinterpreted them as eternal punishment. Gehenna, which meant valley of purification, became hellfire. Ion, which meant a long but finite era or period, became endless eternity. Colossus, which meant disciplinary correction, became vengeful torment. Do you see the strategy? They didn't invent new words. They kept the familiar words but completely changed their meanings. So when people read the ancient texts, they automatically interpreted the new definitions as if they had always been that way. It's the most elegant manipulation trick in history, changing the meaning without changing the words. Phase 2, emotional saturation. Once the language was redefined, they launched a massive campaign of psychological terror. They commissioned the first artistic representations of hell as a place of physical torture. They paid the most charismatic preachers to describe eternal suffering with obsessive detail. But they didn't stop there. They also created what we would today call fabricated testimonies, stories of people who supposedly had visions of hell, accounts of saints who had seen the eternal flames in prophetic dreams, all carefully designed to activate the most primitive fear of the human mind, the terror of infinite pain. Phase 3, monopoly on salvation. Once the fear was established, they presented the solution. Only the institutional church could protect you from eternal punishment. Only the official sacraments could guarantee your salvation. Only complete obedience to ecclesiastical authority could free you from the eternal flames. The circle was complete. They had created the perfect problem to sell the perfect solution, and it worked so well that for the next 1,000 years, no one dared to question it. Until Spinoza came along with his documents. Documents that proved not only that hell had been invented, but how it had been invented, the instruction manuals for the most successful mass psychological manipulation in human history. But do you know what's most disturbing about all this? That the techniques they used in the 6th century are still being used today, not necessarily by churches, but by any institution that needs control based on fear. Governments that terrorize you with invisible enemies so you accept the loss of freedoms. Corporations that terrorize you with manufactured insecurities so you buy products you don't need. Media outlets that terrorize you with exaggerated crises so you compulsively consume their content. They all use variations of the methodology that Justinian perfected in the year 553. Redefine language to change perception, emotionally saturate with fear to paralyze critical thinking, present obedience as the only solution to the terror they themselves created. The formula remains the same, only the superficial details change. Justinian summoned the most important bishops of the Christian world, but he didn't invite them to debate. He summoned them to obey, and he presented them with a list of condemnations, a list of ideas that were to be declared heresies and punished with excommunication. On that list was apokatastasis, but not only that, there was also the pre-existence of the soul, according to Origen. There was also the idea that resurrected bodies would be spiritual, not physical. There was also any teaching that could limit the power of the institutional church to determine who was saved and who wasn't. Bishops who dared to protest were threatened with exile. Those who insisted on defending traditional doctrines were accused of treason against the empire. And so, in a matter of days, 15 centuries of Christian evolution were reversed. Universal hope was replaced by selective terror. Infinite mercy was changed to conditional justice. Eternal hell didn't emerge from the Gospels. It emerged from a boardroom in Constantinople. But this is only the beginning of the story Spinoza uncovered, because what happened after the council was even more sinister. The way they implemented this new doctrine of terror, the way they erased the evidence, the system they built so that no one could ever again question what had been decided in that room. And Spinoza found the cracks in that system. Because you see, when you have a mind like Spinoza's, trained in mathematics, accustomed to implacable logic, you begin to notice inconsistencies that others overlook. Spinoza read the Gospels in Greek. He read the Church Fathers in Latin. He read the Acts of the Councils in their original languages. And what he found left him chilled. The word translated as hell in modern Bibles didn't mean the same thing in the original texts. In Greek, Jesus used the word Gehenna, and Gehenna wasn't a place of eternal torment. It was a real physical valley that existed outside Jerusalem, a place where garbage was burned, a place where, according to Jewish tradition, impurities were purified. Gehenna implied cleansing, not eternal punishment. When the Gospels spoke of the unquenchable fire, they were using a Jewish metaphor that any listener of the time would have understood as purification, not as infinite torture. When they spoke of weeping and gnashing of teeth, they were describing the temporary pain of purification, not the permanent agony of damnation. But in the 4th century, when the church needed more control, these metaphors began to be interpreted literally. And in the 6th century, when Justinian needed more terror, these literal interpretations became unquestionable dogmas. Spinoza saw it all, and he wrote it all down. But he didn't stop there. Because Spinoza was an intellectual rebel, but he was also a historical detective, and he kept digging until he found something that changed him forever. He found the secret letters of the bishops who had been in Constantinople, letters never intended for public eyes, letters where they admitted to changing doctrines not out of theological conviction, but out of political expediency, letters where they confessed that the new eternal hell was a tool of social control. One of those letters, written by a bishop named Pope Vigilius, stated plainly, "It is better that they fear a punishment that does not exist, than that they disobey an authority that does exist." Spinoza copied that phrase into his personal journal. He underlined it 3 times, and beneath it he wrote, "Here is proof of the greatest con job in history." But the story gets even darker, because it turns out that Justinian Wine didn't invent this strategy out of thin air. He had learned it studying the political philosophers of antiquity. Plato, in his Republic, had suggested that the ruling classes should create noble lies to maintain social order, lies that the population would believe for their own good. Aristotle had proposed that fear of divine punishment was more effective than human laws in controlling behavior. and the Roman Stoics had developed a whole theory on how religious beliefs could be used as tools of governance. Justinian I simply applied these ideas to Christianity. He took a religion of hope and turned it into a religion of terror, not because it was truer, but because it was more useful, and it worked perfectly. For the next 1,000 years, nobody dared to question the doctrine of eternal hell. Those who tried were burned alive. Their books were destroyed. Their names were erased from history. Until Spinoza arrived, Spinoza lived in a unique time. Amsterdam in the 17th century was the only place in Europe where a philosopher could write the truth without being immediately executed. It was the only place where dangerous ideas could circulate, even if only in small circles. And Spinoza seized that opportunity. In 1670, he anonymously published his theological political treatise. In its pages, with exquisite care, he demonstrated that eternal hell was not only a human invention, but a relatively recent invention. He showed that the early Christians, including some of the Church's most revered saints, had believed in universal salvation. He showed that the doctrine of eternal hell contradicted not only the character of God, as described in the Gospels, but also the basic principles of justice and mercy. He showed that eternal fire was a logical impossibility, because an infinitely perfect God could not create something infinitely imperfect. And he showed that the entire theological structure of eternal punishment had been built not to save souls, but to control bodies. The book caused a silent revolution. It circulated secretly throughout Europe. It was hand-copied by hundreds of intellectuals who finally found words for their deepest doubts, and the Church panicked. The book was immediately banned. It was included in the Index of Prohibited Books. It was publicly burned in Rome, Paris, and Madrid, and a reward was offered for the identity of its author. But it was too late. The seed had been planted, and that seed carried a devastating message. If they lied about hell, what else did they lie about? The question began to spread like a virus in the brightest minds of Europe. If hell had been invented for political reasons, what other doctrines had been manipulated in the same way? If the councils of the 6th century had altered Christianity to serve the emperors, what else had they altered? And for the first time in 1,000 years, people began to ask the questions they weren't supposed to ask. Spinoza had accomplished something that seemed impossible. He had cracked the monopoly of fear that had controlled Western civilization for 15 centuries, but he knew his work was just beginning, because exposing the lie was only the first step. The second step was to explain why we had been so easily deceived. The third step was to show how to free ourselves from the psychological chains we still carried. And that is exactly what he did in the last 7 years of his life. Years in which he wrote the most dangerous ideas ever put to paper. Ideas that not only demolished the doctrine of hell, but demolished the entire system of control based on religious fear. Ideas that were going to change the world. If anyone was brave enough to understand them, are you ready to know those ideas? Are you prepared to see just how deep this rabbit hole really goes? Because what comes next is going to transform your understanding not only of religion, but of the very nature of reality. In 1675, 2 years before his death, Spinoza finished his most explosive work, a book he didn't even dare to publish during his lifetime. A book so dangerous that his friends kept it hidden for decades after his death. It was called Ethics, and in its pages, Spinoza didn't just demolish the doctrine of hell. He demolished the entire conceptual building that made religious control possible. But what he wrote was so radical, so completely revolutionary, that even today, 350 years later, most people are not prepared to understand it. Spinoza had discovered something that changed everything. He had discovered that the fear of divine punishment was not just a historical lie. It was a logical, impossibility. And he proved it using geometry. Yes, geometry. Spinoza structured his ethics like a mathematical treatise: definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, as if he were solving a problem by Euclid. Because for Spinoza, the truth about God was as precise and demonstrable as the truth about triangles. Let me show you exactly how he did it. Because when you see the mathematical elegance of his argument, you're going to understand why all of Europe trembled when this book appeared. Definition 1. By God I understand a being absolutely infinite, that is, a substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses an eternal and infinite essence. It sounds abstract, but Spinoza was being very precise. If God is absolutely infinite, then there can be nothing outside of God. Because if there was something outside of God, then God would be limited by that external thing, and therefore would not be infinite. Axiom 1. Everything that is either in itself or in another thing. This means that everything that exists must have a cause for its existence. Everything exists either by its own nature, it is in itself, or it exists because something else caused it, it is in another thing. Proposition 14. Except God, no substance can be given or conceived. Do you see where this is going? If God is the only infinite substance, and everything that exists must exist in some substance, then everything that exists must exist in God. This includes every atom of your body, every thought in your mind, every emotion you feel, every action you take. Everything is a modification of the infinite divine substance. Proposition 15. All that is in God, and without God nothing can be or be conceived. And here comes the death blow to the doctrine of hell. If you are a modification of the divine substance, then when you sin, God is sinning through you. When you suffer, God is suffering through you. When you are punished, God is punishing himself through you. Would an infinitely perfect God eternally punish himself? Would an infinitely good God endlessly torture himself? Would an infinitely wise God create a system where a part of himself suffers infinitely? It's absurd, mathematically absurd. But Spinoza didn't stop there. He went deeper, much deeper. Yes, geometry. Spinoza structured his ethics like a mathematical treatise: definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, as if he were solving a problem by Euclid. Because for Spinoza, the truth about God was as precise and demonstrable as the truth about triangles. And his demonstration began with a devastatingly simple premise. If God is infinite, then everything that exists is part of God. There is nothing outside of God. There cannot be. Because if there were something outside of God, then God would not be infinite. This means that you are part of God, that I am part of God, that every criminal, every saint, every imaginary demon, every dreamed-up angel, everything is part of the same infinite divine substance. Do you see the implications? If everything is part of God, then God cannot eternally punish part of himself without eternally punishing himself. If everything is divine by nature, then eternal damnation is God eternally condemning himself, which is absurd. An infinitely perfect God cannot create something infinitely imperfect. An infinitely good God cannot generate infinite evil. An infinitely wise God cannot design an infinitely stupid system. Eternal hell is not just a historical lie, it's a logical contradiction. But Spinoza went further, much further. Because if everything is part of God, then there is no free will as we traditionally understand it. There are no sinners freely choosing evil. There are no saints freely choosing good. There is only the infinite nature of God expressing itself through countless forms, including the human forms that believe they have free will. Does this feel unsettling? It should. Because Spinoza had just removed the very foundation upon which the entire system of guilt, punishment, and religious control is built. But before you panic, let me explain what this really means. Because when Spinoza denied free will, he wasn't turning you into a robot without responsibility. He was freeing you from the cruelest psychological prison ever designed. Imagine discovering that your whole life you've been acting in a play, but nobody told you it was a play. You've been playing a character, but you thought you were really that character. You've been following a script, but you thought you were improvising. That's what Spinoza is showing you. Your personality, with all its fears, desires, and behavior patterns, is like a character in the infinite play that God is performing. But here's the transformative revelation. When you realize you are a character in God's play, you don't lose your identity. You transcend it. Because behind the character is the actor, and the actor is God. When you understand this on an experiential, not just intellectual level, something extraordinary happens. The fear you had of being punished for your sins disappears, because you realize that your sins weren't really yours. They were part of the script that God was playing through you. The guilt you felt for your past mistakes disappears, because you realize that those mistakes were simply moments when the character didn't understand its true nature. The anxiety you had about the future disappears, because you realize that the divine actor behind the character is infinitely capable of handling anything that may come. But here's the most radical part of all. When fear, guilt, and anxiety disappear, what remains is not emptiness. What remains is love. Not love as an emotion, love as recognition. The recognition that everything that exists is an expression of the same divinity that you are. Spinoza called this amor intellectualis Dei, intellectual love of God. But it's not cold or abstract. It's the warmest, most intimate, most joyful experience a human being can have. It's the love that arises when you realize there is no real separation between you and everything you love. It's the love that arises when you understand that every person you meet is another version of yourself. It's the love that arises when you recognize that the entire universe is your true body. And this love, according to Spinoza, is what true spiritual masters have been trying to teach for millennia. But there's more. Because when you live from this understanding, you don't just experience love. You become a channel for divine love to express itself in the world. Every action you take becomes an action of God. Every word you speak becomes a word of God. Every thought you think becomes a thought of God. Not because you are special or superior, but because you recognize what was always true, that God is the only thing that exists, expressing itself through infinitely diverse forms. And when you live from that understanding, the world transforms, not because the world changes, but because your perception of the world becomes divine. If there is no absolute free will, there is no absolute guilt. If there is no absolute guilt, there is no absolute punishment. If there is no absolute punishment, there is no eternal hell. And if there is no eternal hell, then the entire edifice of religious terror collapses like a house of cards. But this raised an even deeper question. If free will is an illusion, if everything is determined by the natural laws of divine reality, then why did suffering exist? Why did what we call evil exist? And here Spinoza revealed the final secret, the secret that made him history's most dangerous philosopher. Evil doesn't exist, not as an independent force, not as a free choice, not as an ontological reality. Evil is merely ignorance. It's the friction that arises when finite parts of infinite reality fail to understand their place in the whole. Imagine you're a single cell in a gigantic organism, but you can only see your tiny portion of the body. From your limited perspective, the liver's functions might seem hostile. The immune system's processes might appear destructive. But if you could see the entire organism, you'd understand that everything is working in perfect harmony towards a larger purpose. Human suffering, according to Spinoza, is exactly that. the experience of finite beings who cannot see the infinite pattern of which they are a part. And salvation isn't escaping the world for a celestial heaven. Salvation is understanding your true place in the world as it is. It's developing what Spinoza called amor intellectualis Dei, intellectual love of God. Not an emotional love for an external divine person, but a joyous understanding of your own divine nature. When you understand that you are part of God, fear disappears. When you understand that everything is connected in an infinite network of perfect causality, guilt disappears. When you understand that death is merely a transformation within the eternal life of nature, even the terror of mortality vanishes. But do you know what's most radical about all this? Spinoza demonstrated that this knowledge requires no faith, no revelation, no ecclesiastical authority. It requires only reason, geometry applied to reality. Anyone with sufficient mathematical education can follow Spinoza's demonstrations and arrive at the same conclusions. The truth about God is accessible through the human intellect, not through religious institutions. And that, more than anything else, terrified the church. Because if people can know God directly, why do they need priests? If salvation is rational understanding, why do they need sacraments? If heaven is realizing your divine nature here and now, why do they need promises of life after death? Spinoza had created the first completely autonomous philosophical system in Western history. A system that needed no external authority to validate itself. A system that made every human being their own theologian, their own philosopher, their own priest. And the implications were devastating for any form of power based on the monopoly of sacred knowledge. That's why Spinoza's books were burned. That's why he was excommunicated by both the synagogue and the church. That's why his name was erased from the official Amsterdam records. But they couldn't erase his ideas. And those ideas began to seep slowly into the brightest minds of Europe. Gottfried Leibniz read Spinoza in secret and developed his own version of universal harmony. David Hume read Spinoza and questioned the entire structure of traditional causality. Immanuel Kant read Spinoza and built his entire philosophical system as a response to the Spinozist challenge. Georg Hegel read Spinoza and created his dialectic of history as a divine process. Friedrich Nietzsche read Spinoza and declared the death of traditional Christian God. Albert Einstein read Spinoza and found in him the inspiration for his vision of a deterministic yet beautiful universe. But let me tell you the specific details of how Spinoza infected their minds. Because when you understand the chain of influence, you realize that all of modern philosophy is a response to the ideas Spinoza planted in the 17th century. Leibniz was a brilliant diplomat working for German princes. When he read Spinoza's Ethics in 1676, he was simultaneously fascinated and terrified, fascinated by the logical elegance of the system, terrified by its implications for traditional religion. So he spent the rest of his life trying to save God from Spinozism. He developed his theory of monads, small individual substances that reflected the universe without being directly connected to each other. It was a brilliant attempt to preserve individuality and free will without contradicting Spinoza's demonstration that everything is connected. But deep down, Leibniz knew Spinoza was right. His last private writings show a man increasingly convinced that reality is fundamentally one, not multiple. David Hume was even more radical. When he read Spinoza in the 1730s, he realized that if everything is causally connected, as Spinoza demonstrated, then the very idea of cause and effect was a psychological illusion. Hume developed his famous skepticism about causality directly from Spinozist insights. If everything is a modification of the same substance, then there are no separate causes acting on separate effects. There are only continuous transformations of the single reality that exists. This understanding terrified Europe's intellectual community so much that Immanuel Kant dedicated 20 years of his life to refuting it. The entire critique of pure reason is essentially an attempt to find a third way between Spinozism and traditional religious dogma. Kant invented the a priori categories and the distinction between phenomena and noumena, specifically to create space for free will and traditional morality within a modified Spinozist framework. But Kant could never resolve the fundamental contradiction. If God is infinite, as Spinoza demonstrated, then there can be nothing outside of God. And if there is nothing outside of God, then human free will is an illusion. Georg Hegel was the first to fully embrace this implication. Instead of fighting against Spinozism, he radicalized it. If everything is God unfolding, then human history is literally God's autobiography. Every war, every revolution, every scientific discovery, every work of art is God coming to know himself more completely. Hegel's absolute spirit is nothing more than Spinoza's God, becoming self-aware through human experience. Friedrich Nietzsche took this even further. If God is all that exists, then the distinction between sacred and profane disappears. If God expresses himself through everything, including what we traditionally call evil, then traditional morality, based on external divine commandments, is absurd. God is dead, Nietzsche declared. But what he really meant was that the traditional Christian God, the God separate from creation, the God who judges from outside, had been killed by Spinoza's logic. In its place, Nietzsche glimpsed what he called the Übermensch, a human being who had realized their own divinity without needing external authorities. And Einstein, the most famous scientist of the 20th century, found in Spinoza the inspiration for his deepest vision of the universe. Spinoza's God, Einstein said, who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists. Einstein rejected the personal God of traditional religion, but embraced Spinoza's impersonal God, the mathematical elegance underlying all physical reality. When Einstein developed general relativity, he was essentially describing the geometry of Spinoza's space-time, a single reality that manifests as multiple from limited perspectives. But there are modern thinkers who have taken Spinoza's ideas even further. Carl Jung discovered the collective unconscious, which is basically the human psyche recognizing its participation in the universal divine mind. Ken Wilber developed his integral philosophy as a modern update of the Spinozan system, showing how cosmic evolution is the way God unfolds toward greater consciousness and complexity. Even contemporary scientists like Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose are exploring theories of consciousness that are essentially Spinozan. The idea that consciousness isn't produced by the brain, but is a fundamental property of reality that the brain simply channels. And quantum physicists like David Bohm have proposed theories of the implicate order that are almost indistinguishable from Spinozan metaphysics, a unified underlying reality that manifests as multiplicity at the level of ordinary experience. Spinoza's influence is so profound and widespread that most of the ideas we consider modern are simply diluted versions of insights he fully developed in the 17th century. Each of these thinkers took a different piece of the puzzle Spinoza had assembled, but none dared to publish the complete picture, because the complete picture was too dangerous. The complete picture showed that all of Western civilization had been built on a fundamental lie, that the system of religious control that had dominated Europe for over 1,000 years was not only false, but unnecessary, that human beings could be free, truly free, not free to choose between good and evil in some absolute moral sense, but free to understand their own divine nature and act from that understanding, free to love without fear of punishment, free to think without fear of heresy, free to live without fear of eternal damnation, And that freedom, more than any military threat, was what truly terrified the established powers, because a truly free human being is uncontrollable. A human being who understands their own divinity doesn't accept arbitrary authorities. A human being who has overcome the fear of hell cannot be manipulated by promises of heaven. That's why Spinoza was the most dangerous philosopher in history, not because he attacked religion from the outside, but because he showed that true religion was something entirely different from what the institutions had been selling. He showed that true religion was knowledge. Knowledge of your own infinite nature. Knowledge of your connection with all that exists. Knowledge that you already are, here and now, everything you ever wanted to be. You don't need to be saved. You're already saved. You just need to realize it. You don't need to earn God's love. You're already part of God. You just need to recognize it. You don't need to escape the world to an imaginary paradise. The world is already paradise. You just need to see it with the right eyes. And those right eyes, according to Spinoza, are the eyes of reason illuminated by love. Reason that understands, love that accepts, wisdom that integrates both into a unified vision of reality. But here comes the most extraordinary part of this whole story, because it turns out that Spinoza wasn't alone in his discoveries. When he began to investigate early Christian texts more deeply, he found that his conclusions had been anticipated by some of the most revered thinkers of the first centuries of Christianity. Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century had taught that the divine fire was purifying, not punitive, that even demons would eventually be restored to their original nature. Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century had argued that evil was simply the absence of good, like darkness is the absence of light, and that this absence would eventually be filled by divine omnipresence. John Scotus Eriugena in the 9th century had written that hell was a psychological state, not a physical place, a condition of ignorance that was resolved with knowledge. Meister Eckhart in the 14th century had taught that the goal of spiritual life was to realize that one was already identical to God at the deepest level of being. All these thinkers had reached conclusions similar to Spinoza's. All had seen through the illusion of eternal hell. All had understood that the true nature of divinity was incompatible with infinite punishment, but all had been silenced, marginalized, or forced to express their ideas in such symbolic language that only a few initiates could understand them. Spinoza was the first to have the audacity to express these ideas in clear, logical, mathematically precise language. The first to build a complete philosophical system that left no room for misinterpretation, and that's why he was the first to be completely banned. But he was also the first to plant the seeds of intellectual liberation that would eventually blossom into the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, modern human rights, the entire structure of personal freedom we take for granted today. It all started with a Jewish philosopher in Amsterdam who dared to tell the truth about hell. And that truth is still just as revolutionary today. Because although most people no longer literally believe in eternal flames, they still live with the psychological structures that belief created. They still live with fear of punishment. They still live with guilt about their own nature. They still live believing they need to be saved by something external instead of realizing what they already are internally, and yet you still allow external authorities to define your worth, your purpose, your relationship with the divine. Spinoza offers a radical alternative. He offers you the possibility of being your own prophet, your own priest, your own savior, not through arrogance, but through the deepest humility, the humility of recognizing that you are part of something infinitely larger than your individual ego, but that this grandeur is your true nature, not something you need to earn or deserve. But how can you apply this understanding to your daily life? How can you live from this Spinozist perspective in a world that still operates from the old paradigms of fear and guilt? The answer is surprisingly practical. Spinoza wasn't just an abstract philosopher, he was also a brilliant psychologist who understood exactly how the human mind works. And he developed specific techniques to free oneself from the mental patterns that the doctrine of hell had engraved on the Western psyche. The first technique is what he called knowledge of the third kind. Not conceptual knowledge about God, but direct experience of your own divine nature. This is achieved through what modern psychologists would call radical mindfulness, a clear and constant observation of your own mental processes, so that you begin to see that your thoughts, emotions, and sensations are manifestations of something much vaster than your individual personality. But Spinoza was much more specific about how to develop this capacity. He developed what he called exercises of eternity, concrete practices to experience your infinite nature even while living in a finite body. Exercise 1. The perspective of the infinite witness. Sit in silence for 10 minutes each day. But instead of trying to empty your mind, do the exact opposite. Observe every thought, every emotion, every sensation that arises. But don't identify with any of them. Instead, ask yourself, who is observing this thought? Who is being aware of this emotion? Who is experiencing this sensation? When you find that conscious presence that is being aware of everything else, you will have found what Spinoza called your eternal essence. That presence wasn't born when you were born, and it won't die when you die. It's your direct participation in the infinite consciousness of God. Exercise 2. The dissolution of bodily limits. This sounds esoteric, but Spinoza based it on rigorous empirical observation. Your feeling of having a body separate from the rest of the universe is a useful illusion, but it remains an illusion. Lie down comfortably and close your eyes. Begin to pay attention to the sensations on your skin. Notice that there is no clear line where you end and the air begins. Then pay attention to your breath. Notice that the air that enters your lungs becomes part of you, and the air you exhale becomes part of the environment. Continue expanding your attention until you realize that you are in constant exchange with everything around you: atoms, molecules, energy, information. There are no real boundaries. When you experience this directly, you understand what Spinoza meant when he wrote that we do not know where the human body ends. Exercise 3. The transmutation of negative emotions. This is probably the most practical exercise Spinoza developed. Instead of fighting against emotions like fear, anger, or sadness, you use them as gateways to the divine experience. The next time you feel an intense emotion, don't try to change it. Instead, go directly to the center of the emotion and ask yourself, what divine energy is being expressed through this particular emotion? Fear, when examined closely, is survival energy. It is divine life protecting the form through which it is temporarily expressing itself. Anger, when examined closely, is energy of justice. It is divine wisdom responding to the perception that something is out of harmony. Sadness, when examined closely, is energy of love. It is the divine heart responding to the perception of separation or loss. When you see emotions in this way, they cease to be problems that you need to solve. They become sacred experiences that connect you more deeply with your divine nature. The second technique is what he called amor fati, love of fate. Not passive resignation, but active understanding that everything that has happened in your life, including all suffering, has been necessary to bring you exactly where you need to be. But Spinoza developed specific methods to cultivate this perspective when you find yourself in the midst of real suffering. Exercise 4. Historical recontextualization, When you find yourself in a difficult situation, instead of asking yourself, "Why is this happening to me?" ask yourself, "How is God using this experience to develop wisdom and compassion through me?" Then go further. Ask yourself, "If I were a character in an epic novel about spiritual awakening, what purpose would this difficult chapter serve in the overall story?" This exercise doesn't minimize your pain, but it places it in a broader context that gives it meaning. Exercise 5. Impossible gratitude. This is the most radical exercise Spinoza developed. When something terrible has happened to you, after you have fully processed the emotional pain, try to find something for which you can be genuinely grateful in that experience. Not forced or superficial gratitude, real gratitude for some authentic aspect of the experience. Perhaps it taught you compassion for others who suffer. Perhaps it showed you strengths in yourself that you didn't know you had. Perhaps it freed you from illusions that were limiting you. When you can find genuine gratitude even in suffering, you will have understood what Spinoza meant by amor fati. The third technique is what he called eternity. Not life after death, but life beyond time. The understanding that your true identity transcends your temporal existence, even though it is expressed through it. Exercise 6. Meditation on death. This isn't morbid when done correctly. It's incredibly liberating. Once a month, dedicate a full hour to contemplating your own death. Not the process of dying, but the fact that your current body and your current personality are going to disappear completely. But while contemplating this, pay attention to what in you does not feel threatened by this perspective. There is something in you that observes the idea of death without terror. There is something in you that feels vaster than anything that can die. That which cannot die. That is what Spinoza called your eternal essence. And when you connect with it directly, death loses its terror because you realize that what you truly are cannot be destroyed. Exercise 7. Connecting with future ancestors. This sounds strange, but it's incredibly powerful for developing an eternal perspective. Imagine yourself as an ancestor to generations born 500 years from now. What wisdom would you want to pass on to them? What mistakes would you want them to avoid? What beauty would you want them to preserve? Now recognize that you are already the ancestor of those future generations. The decisions you make today will genuinely affect them. The genes you pass on, the culture you create, the environment you leave behind, it will all impact human beings who haven't even been born yet. When you feel your connection to the distant future, your present problems are put into perspective, and simultaneously, your present actions acquire a sacred meaning. The fourth technique is what he called salvation. Through knowledge. But not intellectual knowledge, embodied knowledge, the complete integration of philosophical understanding with lived experience. Exercise 8. The practice of everyday divinity. This is the most transformative exercise of all, but also the simplest. For a week, try to remember every hour you're awake that you are an expression of God, not as a belief, but as an experiment, to see how your experience changes. When you speak with someone, remember you're speaking with another expression of the same divinity you are. When you eat, remember you are nourishing a temporary form that God is using to experience physical reality. When you work, remember you are participating in God's infinite creativity. When you rest, remember you are allowing God to renew themselves through your form. At first, this will feel artificial or forced, but after several days of consistent practice, you'll begin to directly experience what Spinoza called beatitude, the experience of being completely aligned with your own divine nature. Exercise 9. The transmutation of relationships. Human relationships become completely different when you live them from a Spinozist perspective. Instead of relating to others as separate personalities who can help or harm you, begin relating to them as other aspects of the same divinity you are. This doesn't mean you lose appropriate boundaries or tolerate abusive behavior. It means that even when you need to protect yourself from someone, you can do so without hatred or resentment, because you understand that their destructive behavior comes from their temporary ignorance of their own divine nature, not from some inherent evil. And when you can love someone, even while protecting your boundaries from their behavior, you will have understood what Spinoza meant by intellectual love. Exercise 10. The dissolution of fear of authority. This exercise is specifically designed to free you from the fear patterns that the doctrine of hell etched into the Western psyche. The next time you feel fear or intimidation in the face of some authority, a boss, the government, a religious institution, a public figure, remember that that person is also a temporary expression of the same infinite divinity that you are. This doesn't mean you disrespect legitimate roles or competencies. It means you don't project divine power onto fallible human figures. When you truly understand that your deepest authority comes from your own participation in divinity, you don't need to seek external validation or approval to know your own worth. And when you don't need external validation, you cannot be controlled by promises of approval or threats of punishment. These techniques aren't just philosophical exercises. They are precise spiritual technologies to free you from the mental patterns that 1,500 years of religious terror have etched into the human psyche. And when you practice them consistently, something extraordinary happens. You begin to live from what Spinoza called the perspective of eternity, a way of being that completely transcends the fear, the guilt, and the anxiety that the artificial hell system was designed to create. But before we reach the end of this story, you need to understand something crucial. The methodology that Justinian perfected in the year 553 didn't disappear when people stopped literally believing in eternal flames. It evolved, it adapted, it secularized, and it's still being used today by any institution that needs fear-based control. Remember the 3 phases of the psychological manipulation plan they developed in Constantinople: redefinition of language, emotional saturation, and monopoly of salvation. Look around you. Don't you see the exact same pattern operating in modern politics, in the mass media, in consumer culture, even in some social justice movements? Phase 1. Redefinition of language. Politicians take words like freedom, security, progress, and give them new meanings that serve their agendas. Freedom becomes obedience to the state. Security becomes acceptance of surveillance. Progress becomes adoption of technologies that increase control. The mass media takes complex events and reduces them to simplistic good versus evil narratives that generate emotional addiction but not real understanding. Corporations take words like success, happiness, fulfillment, and redefine them in terms of consuming products. Phase 2. Emotional saturation. News designed to constantly activate your sympathetic nervous system. Crisis after crisis after crisis, designed to keep you in a state of perpetual alert. Advertising that activates insecurities about your appearance, your status, your sexual performance, your worth as a person. Entertainment that feeds you constant doses of artificial drama to keep you emotionally reactive but intellectually passive. Social media designed to activate the brain's reward centers intermittently, creating psychological addiction. Phase 3. Monopoly of salvation. Only our political party can save you from catastrophe. Only our products can make you happy. Only our ideology can give you meaning. Only our experts can protect you from danger. Do you see the pattern? The fundamental structure is identical to what Justinian designed in the 6th century, only the superficial details have changed. And the reason it continues to work is because most people never learned the techniques Baruch Spinoza developed to free themselves from fear-based manipulation. They never learned to distinguish between rational fears based on real dangers and manufactured fears designed to generate obedience. They never learned to find internal authority instead of seeking it in external figures. They never learned to live from their own divine nature instead of seeking validation in fallible human institutions. That's why Spinoza's ideas are more relevant today than when he wrote them. Because we live in an age where psychological control techniques have become incredibly sophisticated. But we also live in an age where we have access to all the knowledge of human history, where we can study the liberation techniques that the greatest masters developed over millennia, where we can apply Spinoza's insights with the help of modern discoveries in neuroscience, psychology, and quantum physics. The path to real freedom has never been clearer, but it has also never been more urgent, because we are at a pivotal moment in human history, a moment where we can choose to evolve toward a civilization based on wisdom and compassion, or to devolve into a technological dystopia based on fear and control. The choice depends on whether enough people are willing to do the inner work that Spinoza described, the work of recognizing their own divinity, the work of freeing themselves from fear-based mental patterns, the work of living from love instead of from terror. And that work begins with recognizing the fundamental lie on which Western civilization was built, the lie that you are a miserable sinner in need of external salvation. The truth, as Spinoza demonstrated mathematically, is exactly the opposite. You are a perfect expression of infinite divinity. You always have been, you always will be. You don't need to save yourself. You just need to remember who you are. This means living every moment from the perspective that you are a part of God, not as a belief, but as a constant experiential reality. It means treating every person you meet as another expression of the same divinity that you are, not out of moral obligation, but out of direct recognition. It means seeing every situation, no matter how difficult, as an opportunity for divine wisdom to express itself through you. And it means understanding that your life is not your life. It is the life of God living through the form you temporarily call you. When you really understand this, something extraordinary happens. Fear disappears. Not because you decide to be brave, but because you recognize that what you truly are cannot be threatened. Guilt disappears, not because you forgive yourself, but because you see that past mistakes were simply temporary ignorance of your true nature. Anxiety about the future disappears, not because the future becomes predictable, but because you understand that what you truly are is perfectly equipped to handle anything that may come. And existential emptiness disappears, not because your life acquires an external purpose, but because you recognize that your very existence is the purpose. You are the way infinite reality knows itself through a particular perspective. This is what Spinoza called beatitude, not temporary happiness, but eternal joy. The experience of being completely aligned with your own deepest nature, and this beatitude, according to Spinoza, is what the true spiritual masters of all traditions have been pointing to. What Jesus called the kingdom of heaven, what Buddhists call nirvana, what Sufis call fana, what Jewish mystics call devekut, they were all talking about the same experience, the experience of recognizing your own divinity, the experience of living from that understanding, and they were all misinterpreted by the religious institutions that turned their teachings into fear-based systems of control. Spinoza saw all of this. He understood everything, and he expressed it in a way that makes misinterpretation impossible. That's why his philosophy remains so relevant 350 years later, because it offers a way out of the labyrinth of fear and guilt in which Western humanity has been trapped for centuries. It offers a way to be truly religious without being superstitious, a way to be truly spiritual without being irrational, a way to be truly free without being irresponsible. And it all begins with recognizing that hell never existed, that it was invented by men who needed control, that it has no basis in the reality of divine nature, that it is completely incompatible with any God worthy of worship. When you see through that fundamental lie, all the other lies begin to crumble as well, and in the space that remains, something new can be born. Something that Spinoza called a free man, a human being who lives from his own internal divine authority. A human being who doesn't need external permission to be happy, to be wise, to be holy. A human being who has discovered that he is already everything he ever sought to be, that he only needed to remember who he really was, and that remembrance, according to Spinoza, was true salvation. Not salvation from the world, but salvation in the world. Not escape from human life, but total fulfillment of human life, because when you understand that you are divine, human life becomes sacred. When you understand that you are eternal, time becomes precious. When you understand that you are infinite, each finite moment becomes an opportunity for unlimited expression. This is what Spinoza discovered in the last years of his life, and this is what he died trying to teach us. The doctrine of hell was not just a lie about the afterlife. It was a lie about the here and now. A lie that convinced us that we were miserable sinners instead of magnificent expressions of divinity. A lie that robbed us of our power, our dignity, our trust in our own fundamental goodness. A lie that turned life into a test we had to pass, instead of a gift we had to celebrate. But now you know the truth that Spinoza risked everything to reveal to us. Hell was invented in the year 553. It was designed to control you, and it has no power over you except the power that you give it. You can continue to live as if it were real. You can continue to operate from the fear and guilt it generates, or you can choose the freedom that Spinoza offers you, the freedom to be who you truly are. The freedom to live from your own divinity. It's a choice, your choice, and it always has been, but now, at least, it's an informed choice, a choice illuminated by the shadows, by the hidden currents of history that have shaped our understanding of ourselves and our place in the cosmos, a choice that hinges on a deeper understanding of power, deception, and the enduring legacy of Baruch Spinoza. Imagine, if you will, the swirling smoke of the Second Council of Constantinople, the hushed whispers in the Hagia Sophia, the very air thick with the weight of centuries, of dogma and deceit. Think of Pope Vigilius, caught in the currents of Byzantine intrigue. His decisions, his compromises, all shaping the landscape of Christian belief and all impacting the future trajectory of a radical thinker born centuries later. Baruch Spinoza, a name whispered in hushed tones, a man who dared to challenge the very foundations of power, a man who confronted the corrupt bishops and the emperor himself, facing the eternal flames of hell for daring to question the established order. His theological, political treatise, a revolutionary document, a birth certificate of your worst nightmare for the entrenched powers of his time, a testament to the enduring power of individual thought, a challenge to the accepted narrative. Imagine the bustling streets of Amsterdam, the intellectual ferment of the 17th century. Spinoza, a lens grinder by trade, a philosopher by nature, his work read in secret, discussed in hidden corners, his ideas radical, dangerous, revolutionary, spreading like wildfire, undermining centuries of carefully constructed religious authority. His ideas, like seeds sown in the fertile ground of doubt, planted in the hearts and minds of those who dared to question. What if the history we've been told, the accepted narratives, the carefully curated images presented in public squares and boardrooms are not the whole story? What if the truth lies buried, waiting to be unearthed, waiting for you to rediscover it, to embrace it, and in doing so, to unleash your own inner power, the power to define your truth, your divinity? This is not simply an intellectual exercise, it's a journey into the heart of power, of deception, and ultimately of liberation. A journey that begins with Baruch Spinoza and leads to you. What will you choose?